Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Good morning, everybody. We'll continue now where we concluded yesterday on page 63 of the book Rome and Civil Liberty by James A. Wiley. Remember Cardinal Wiseman being empowered by the Pope. The Cardinal came to Great Britain and divided up the land into dioceses and appointed over each diocese a bishop to set up a parallel government to the legitimate government of England, a Protestant government. And so James A. Wiley is going to ask us some questions about this particular cardinal and where he gets his power, and for what end does he exercise that power in England. He says in the first full paragraph on page 63, the first question here is, who is Cardinal Wiseman, and what is his rank? The man himself is an ecclesiastic, in other words, a church official, but his rank and the title as cardinal are purely temporal. Okay? They have nothing to do with church. It has to do with governing. He is a senator of Rome, a member of the Electoral College, a prince of the Roman states, and last and highest of all, having regard to his status in our country, as that status is viewed from Rome, he is the representative of the sovereign of the Roman states. In other words, he is the representative of the Pope. And to him alone is his allegiance due. Not to the Queen, not to the British people, but to a foreign potentate. Now, how would you like it if somebody from Russia came to this country and divided up the land and appointed temporal rulers over each one of those divisions, and that this man from Russia represented Putin? Wouldn't like it very good, would you? Why are we so tolerant of the Roman pontiff asserting himself over the legitimate government of this country? We should be no more amenable to a hostile foreign power such as the papacy being in control of a separate government in this country as we would if President Putin did the same thing. Cardinal Wiseman, and every cardinal, is a citizen of Rome, a citizen of the Vatican, and they speak for the Pope. And when we view a cardinal, when we cast our eyes upon a scarlet-colored cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, we should view him as a personification of the papacy. That's who he represents. Now he says the next question is, what kind of authority is it which he exercises in our country? And from what source does he draw it? Is it the case with the cardinal, as with every other judge and magistrate and official of the realm, that he derives his authority from the Queen, and that he exercises it in subordination to the law of the land, and is amenable to the law? It is not so. The cardinal's authority is drawn avowedly from a foreign source. That source, the sovereign of another state, and it is wielded without subordination to the Queen or to the law. The cardinal is accountable to the pontiff, and to the pontiff alone. He is an independent ruler in the realm. As cardinal, he knows neither queen nor law. He is a vice king in the right of his designation by the Pope. Okay, James A. Wiley's made it very clear. No cardinal represents anybody in this country. No cardinal speaks for anybody in this country. The cardinal speaks for the Pope. He is the power of the Pope vested in another man. When he speaks, it is as if the Pope speaks. And he is both a spiritual leader over the Roman Catholic Church and a temporal ruler over all of the people that are under his jurisdiction. And that is every man, woman, and child in the country. Because Rome makes no distinction between Protestants and Catholics. When they've set up their government, they govern all. When they set up their dioceses and archdioceses, they govern everyone within those dioceses. It is a hostile form of government. It is in direct opposition to our form of government. It is a constant conflict with our form of government until it conforms our form of government to the Pope's. That is the very essence of the Roman Catholic Church. Wherever it exists, it eventually rules. All right, now he continues, he says, but may it not be said that the Supreme Courts of Judicature in the various religious bodies exercise a jurisdiction which, like that of the cardinal, is not drawn from the Queen and is not amenable to the law? There's a wide difference between the two cases, which we pray our readers to ponder. The jurisdiction of these bodies has its source within the kingdom. The source of the cardinal's jurisdiction is outside the kingdom. These bodies exercise a purely spiritual jurisdiction. The full half, that is at least 50% of the cardinal's jurisdiction, is temporal. Not just spiritual, but temporal. It says the jurisdiction of these bodies is an integral part of the Constitution and is accordant with the law of the land, inasmuch as it is based upon the Bible, which is indeed the most fundamental part of the Constitution of the realm and its statutory law. The cardinal ignores our Constitution, our law, and our Bible. And he knows only the ex cathedra edicts of the popes. That is, whatever the pope speaks from his throne in Rome. That's the only thing that the cardinal recognizes. The cardinal ignores our Constitution, our law, and our Bible, and knows only the ex cathedra edicts of the popes, dead and living, the canon law. So Roman Catholic canon law is an expression of the edicts of the popes throughout history. Not just the living pope who reigns at the time, but the canon law is a compilation of all the edicts and decrees and bulls and encyclical letters written by the popes for 2,000 years. And the canon law has no regard whatsoever for the civil laws of any land. Canon law is, as it were, the divine law in Roman Catholicism. And it is regarded as supreme law, in that it trumps every other law. So any law in any land that contradicts or conflicts with the Roman Catholic canon law is thus overthrown. And it is null and void upon its face, and it has no power. So if that's not a usurpation of the legitimate government of England, there is no such thing. He says, our spiritual courts submit their sentences as regards their civil effects to the revisal of the civil courts, to which they themselves are amenable in all things civil, rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. The cardinal knows no distinction of things. His jurisdiction confounds all, and subjects all to the pontiff, who is to him God on earth. Okay? So the Pope is God on earth to this cardinal, and Roman Catholic canon law is divine law. Are you beginning to get the picture? Now he says the members of our religious courts have each of them sworn allegiance to the Queen and are her subjects. The cardinal has sworn unconditional allegiance to the Pope, and therefore can in no true sense be a subject of the Queen or a member of the nation. And if meanwhile he must in some respects act as if he were, he submits himself to the, quote, powers that be, unquote, not for, quote, conscience sake, unquote, but, quote, for wrath's sake. In other words, the cardinal, if he is forced to abide by the civil laws of the land and be subject to the Queen, he does only for expedience sake, to save his own hide. But barring that, barring any fear of wrath from the Queen or the established government of England, he may do as he pleases. So expediency is the main restraint of this cardinal. Without fear of the Queen and the established government, he would run roughshod anytime he wants, in any way he wants, so long as he answers to the Pope. All right. His acts of submission are done virtually under protest, when he must forcibly be in apparent recognition of the government. He does so under protest. Okay, and naturally he would, under being bound by Roman Catholic canon law and a subject of a foreign pontiff. Anytime he would have to temporarily, at least, obey the civil power in order not to jeopardize their mission in England, to that extent he obeys the civil government. But when it becomes advantageous, when it may be done so without threat to the establishment of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, he is free to do as the Pope directs. That's exactly the state of affairs here in the United States of America. Relentlessly, they chisel away at the Constitution, they chisel away at the Bill of Rights, and they chisel away at the established laws of our land and put in their place Roman Catholic canon law. And if they ever cease to do that, they cease to be subjects of the Roman Pontiff, to whom they depend for salvation. So this is not just a civil attack. It's bound by religious pretenses. If they fail to perform their duties as cardinals, they cease to be under the jurisdiction of the papacy. They can be ipso facto excommunicated and cast into eternal damnation. So they have spiritual reasons to fight this eternal fight. And who is it against whom they are fighting? Ultimately, Christ in a Protestant land. Ultimately, the Bible in a Protestant land. And that's the point that James A. Wiley is making. He says, so full, independent, and supreme is the authority which has been arrogated and is now being exercised by the new king, that is the cardinal, who has set up his throne by the side of that of our queen and is creating a Roman kingdom in the heart of the British one. Accordingly, his act, as we have seen, was an exercise of that royal supremacy which the nation has vested in the sovereign, whereby he declared void all the ecclesiastical arrangements of the kingdom and annulled all the ecclesiastical titles and offices, creating others in their place in virtue of his own plenary supremacy given him by the pontiff. Okay, this is the authority by which this cardinal divided up the land, replaced all of the ecclesiastical offices with other titles and other men directly subservient to him, and ultimately subservient to the papacy. This can be described in no other way as a hostile takeover of Great Britain. No less hostile than it would if Putin of Russia set up a parallel government and divided up the land of the United States. It would be met with immediate opposition. But because Rome can claim itself to be a church, can claim itself to be a quote-unquote Christian church, people tolerate it. They ignore its import. They ignore the consequences. They wish not to get involved in such a dirty affair. And they pretend it doesn't happen. Pretend it's not happening. They do the ostrich routine. Dig a hole, stick their head in it, and cover it back up. And that's what we're doing in the United States of America, mostly because we don't recognize the fact that because that we're losing our liberties, our Constitution is being destroyed, not because of rebels in Washington, D.C., but papists in Washington, D.C. And when we come to the realization that the destruction of our Constitution, the destruction of our liberties, is come from the papacy, then we might take notice and might do something effective about it. Until that time, we'll just be muddled down in this pretended opposition between Democrats and Republicans. We'll chalk it all up to politics, and no one will ever know who the enemy is. James A. Wiley and the Protestants of Great Britain are struggling at the time of the writing of this book, just like the United States is struggling today. Not able to determine where its assault is coming from. It's coming from the same place in Great Britain as it's coming from in the United States today, the papacy, the self-styled King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The papacy does not like the Constitution of the United States. The proof is in history. In 1864, just 1 year before the writing of this book, when Pope Pius IX, the same pope that we're talking about in this book, wrote his famous encyclical Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Error of 1864. Just 6 years before the Roman Catholic Church declared Pope Pius IX infallible, in the Syllabus of Error, he condemned every non-Roman Catholic Constitution and Bill of Rights. Every form of government that did not answer directly to the papacy, every form of government that acknowledged the Bible as its basis and Christ as its head, was condemned by the papacy in 1864 in the Syllabus of Error. The Roman Catholic Church is solidly on record that it will not rest until the entire world is brought to submission to the papacy. And that is exactly the war that is taking place in this country under the cloak of political wranglings, Democratic and Republican, left and right. But this is a religious war. And until the American people recognize the basis for the conflicts and the destruction of our Constitution and Bill of Rights, they will never be able to defend themselves against this onslaught from Rome. We're going to continue to lose our liberties until we come to the reality that the very thing that's happening in Great Britain in 1865 is that which is happening in the United States today. And unless we rise up with Protestant fervor, we will be overthrown and be made subjects, whether we want to or not, to the Roman Pontiff. We will have made our allegiance with the Antichrist, and we will have repudiated Jesus Christ. That is the reality. As difficult as it may, we may wish not to believe this, it's the truth nonetheless. Now, the position of the cardinal at the head of the Roman body in Great Britain has accomplished not merely a change on the exterior relations of that church, but a change also of no little importance in her internal structure and working. Formerly, the Popish community, that is the Roman Catholic community of Great Britain, was governed by bishops. Being without a head, their action was spasmodic and fitful, and not unfrequently conflicting. But this evil has now been cured by the substitution of a prince of the Roman states, the cardinal, in whom the whole authority of the Roman Church in Britain is centered, and by whom its whole action is wielded. Okay, now all of a sudden, if there was ever confusion in the Roman Catholic community of Great Britain, they now have a supreme head. They're going to focus all their efforts in an organized fashion. There won't be any dissent. There won't be any confusion. There won't be any spasmodical conflicts. They now have all but one head, the cardinal, and his head is the Pope. Now they are effective. They're going to do something in England. He says the cardinal is the Pope's alter ego. He speaks and acts with the weight of Peter himself, the apostle, thus bearing down all opposition, extinguishing all division, and giving greater combination and power to the Roman Church than it has had for centuries, or perhaps that it ever had. Seeing the kingdom in our day is more open than in almost any former age to the free importation of Romanism in both its spirit and its edicts. Okay? Rome has taken advantage at this particular time in 1865 because England had lost its Protestant fervor. What is that fervor? What is the central belief of Protestantism? That the papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible. And because Great Britain, for one reason or another, and I say it was because of futurism, and it was because of the Tractarians who were trying to Catholicize the country, Rome had been having second thoughts about the Pope being the Antichrist. And they took no opposition when this cardinal began to divide up the land and appoint bishops over the country. They became sentimental to their Roman Catholic fellow citizens and wished them to have the same liberties that they had. And what they were literally doing was allowing another government to set up shop in England. This is what happens when Protestants forget who the Antichrist is. Their charity takes over, and they begin to become sympathetic to Roman Catholics. And that's the open door that the papacy needs to come in and take over. It's happened in Great Britain at the time of the writing of this book. It's happening in the United States today. He says the cardinal is the Pope's alter ego. There's your problem. The cardinals of this country, the Jesuit priests. And he says he acts with the weight of Peter himself, thus bearing down all opposition. Okay? We don't oppose those who call themselves Christ or Christians, do we? No, this is a quote-unquote Christian country by everyone's account. And as long as we acknowledge Roman Catholicism as Christianity, the sentiments of sympathy for Romans will continue to be the same, and the Pope will still have the authority that he needs to take over the country. Roman Catholicism, by no stretch of the imagination, has anything whatsoever to do with Christianity. It is anti-Christianity, and the Pope is the man of sin, and history is repeating itself in this country. It's repeating what happened in England in 1865. We have to wake up and return to our Protestant understanding of history and of the Bible. The man of sin rules this country, and we need to know it, and we need to do something about it. We'll be back right after this.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now, why was the Pope allowed to do this? Why was Cardinal Wiseman allowed to just charge into the country and take over? For this reason. James A. Wiley says the kingdom, that is Great Britain, in our day, in 1865, is more open than in almost any former age to the free importation of Romanism in both its spirit and its edicts. Protestant England, that once recognized the Pope as the Antichrist, that had kicked out the Jesuits, kicked out the Roman Catholic Church, made the practice of Roman Catholicism illegal because it was the Church of Antichrist, all of a sudden has a change of heart. What happened in England that allowed it, that permitted it to be sympathetic toward Romanism? and the papal church. Well, that's a subject for great study. I've already made my assessment that it was because futurism had taken sway in Great Britain. It opened the door for Bible-believing Christians to see Roman Catholics as fellow Christians, because futurism exonerates the papacy from the onus of Antichrist. Futurism teaches a future Antichrist, a single individual, that signs a peace treaty with the Jews, and after 3.5 years he breaks the treaty. That had been taught in Great Britain beginning in the 1800s. Here it is, 1865. It's had 65 years to do its work. And here we see England now becoming sympathetic to Roman Catholicism, even to the degree that it would sit still and allow the Pope to set up a shadow government within the realm, and to compete tooth and nail with the legitimate Protestant government of England. You see what's happened in Great Britain at this time? It's the very thing that happened in the United States in 1965. Just 100 years later, the same thing happened in the United States. Protestants, forgetting their Protestant belief that the papacy is the Antichrist, the Roman Catholic Church is the synagogue of Satan, the counterfeit church, became sympathetic and sentimental to Roman Catholics because they no longer believe the Pope is the Antichrist. And so nobody protests the Roman Catholic control of our government anymore. Nobody protests when a cardinal meets with the presidential candidates during a presidential election year. Nobody protests when the Council of Bishops of the United States get together and talk about politics and support political candidates for office. Nobody protests anymore because the Protestants have nothing about which to protest anymore. They have nothing to fear in Roman Catholic control of the government because they regard them as fellow Christians. The very same thing that happened in England in 1865 repeated itself in 1965 in the United States of America. England had her ecumenical movement in 1865. We had our ecumenical movement in 1965. And neither could have happened had it not been for futurism. Now, James A. Wiley's going to spend the rest of the time of his in this book telling us the results of the ecumenical movement in England in 1865. And we owe it to ourselves to pay particular attention to this and see that history is literally repeating itself in the United States of America. This is the key to understanding why we're losing our Constitution, why we're losing our civil rights, why we are fighting wars all over the world, why there is no peace, why there is no security, when everybody is preaching peace and security. This is truly eye-opening for my listeners. He says the cardinal is the Pope's alter ego. He speaks and acts with the weight of Peter himself, thus bearing down all opposition, extinguishing all division, and giving greater combination and power to the Roman Church than it has had for centuries in England, or perhaps than it ever had Seeing the kingdom in our day, Great Britain is more open than in almost any former age to the free importation of Romanism in both its spirit and its edicts. In the Cardinal, Rome has been brought to Westminster. Peter's chair has been set up in Great Britain, and the Vatican has been transferred from the Tiber to the Thames. You might say in our country today, the Vatican has been transferred from the Tiber to Tiber Creek, the Potomac. The old spasmodic and divided action of the Church of Rome amongst us has been replaced by an action that is steady and systematic, and which is skillfully directed upon one great and well-defined object, namely, the seizure of the country, together with the appropriation of its wealth and the prostitution, and the prostitution of its power to the pontifical see. That's just language, as I have so well repeated so many times. It's a takeover of the country. It happened in England. It happened in the United States. And only 100 years separated the two events. It happened the same way. You'd think that after 2 millennia of this sort of thing, that humanity would wake up to the reality. But we keep having to learn the same lessons over and over and over and over again. Why? Because we're too timid to preach from the pulpits who the Antichrist is, what his operations have been all throughout history, what their operations are today, and how we can recognize it and what we can do about it. You won't find that kind of intimidation here at Inquisition Update. I'm not afraid to offend the Antichrist of the Bible, nor am I afraid to offend those who follow him. I love Christ. I love the Bible, and I love Protestantism, and I love his heavenly kingdom. And it's no cost to me, no lasting cost to me, to put life and limb in jeopardy in denouncing this counterfeit in Rome. I owe it to Christ, I owe it to my own soul to do what is right, to defend Christ and his law against Antichrist and his canon law. Now he continues, he says, if it be good that we should serve a foreign priest, let us no longer be subjects of Queen Victoria. We may be well assured that both we cannot serve. If slavery be the better part, let us be slaves. But if we prefer to be ruled by the sovereign of our own choice, and to be judged by the law of our own making, then let us halt no longer betwixt two masters. Let us be a little more decided, and dally no longer with our queen's prerogatives and our own liberties. So James A. Wiley simply just telling England, we must make a choice. We find ourselves now faced with serving two masters who are diametrically opposed to one another. And we must make a choice. And if it's slavery that we love, then we will serve the Pope. And if it's liberty we love, we will serve the Protestant government. It's a choice between Christ and Antichrist. It's literally the same choice that we are faced with here today in America, only 100 years later. And who brought this choice upon us? Vatican Council II. Ecumenism. Now, will you be a slave? Or will you enjoy the liberty whereby Christ has made us free? Continuing now in the book, the next portion of the chapter is entitled The 12 Thrones. Remember, the cardinal divided up England into 12 jurisdictions, dioceses, and appointed a ruler over each. This is what we're talking about, the 12 thrones. In speaking of the new monarchy that is growing apace among us, we have given, as was right, precedence to its monarch. And now it is fitting that we should speak of his inferior rulers, that is, those subservient to the Pope. In Cardinal Wiseman, we behold the great apostle of this second planting of the Church of England. But the cardinal did not come alone. He was attended by a goodly following of 12 suffragans who were to take part with him in this great work. These are the princes of his kingdom. These are the apostles whom he and his master have appointed to sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes or dioceses into which the nation has been divided. Thus has the new kingdom received at once unity and diffusion. Unity in the cardinal, which is unity in the Pope, and diffusion in the 12 suffragan bishops. The 12 territorial bishops form an organic machinery, which renders the now centralized authority of the Roman Church practically available for the government of Romanists in our country. The grand object of the propaganda in the erection of territorial dioceses and the appointment of a bishop over each with jurisdiction was, quote-unquote, synodical action. This was much insisted upon at the time. It was pleaded in defense of the papal aggression because without bishops with territorial status and titles, synods could not, according to the rules of the Roman Catholic Church, be convened. And without provincial synods, the government of the Church could not be carried on. The real drift of quote-unquote synodical action, and especially its bearing on the independence of the nation, was not then very clearly perceived, but events have since helped to make it exceedingly plain. Provincial synods are holden by past decrees touching the government of their church. These decrees are sent to Rome, and Rome then received the sanction of the Pope. And when so ratified, they are returned to Great Britain, having all the authority of papal bulls. Now, what did he just tell you? These 12 jurisdictions are not really jurisdictions unless they function as jurisdictions. In other words, you can divide up the land, but if you don't appoint a government, or that government once appointed does never do anything, then it's not really a jurisdiction, is it? I mean, you're not really a homeowner. Even though you pay for the house, you write a check for the house if you never move into it. Well, these 12 dioceses had to function as dioceses or they didn't really exist. So they got together and they passed laws and decrees in the founding of the organization of their church, passing synodical orders, and then wrote them all up in a report and sent them to Rome. And then once reviewed by the Pope and those under his authority to review such matters, it received the approval of the Pope. And then once that approval was given, it was sent back to England as if it were another papal bull. In other words, it becomes part of the canon law. It's binding. So that's what a synodical action is. When the synod of bishops get together, it's like I mentioned it just a moment ago before the break, the Council of Bishops that get together in this country. The Catholic bishops of this country get together and they talk about church business and they pass off their rules and regulations for the church and for you and me, and they pass them all off to the Pope, and the Pope signs them, and they come back to the United States and they're added to the canon law. That's how the government of the popes work. That's what makes them King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what makes it a foreign government that operates independently and irresponsibly, that is responsible to no one, right here in the United States of America. Synodical action. Okay, now he says the monthly importation of bulls from Rome, that is papal bulls from Rome, and their public proclamation in the country would have awakened alarm, would have raised troublesome questions, and might have led eventually to the revival of some of the old securities against the trafficking of foreign priests. But these difficulties are dexterously avoided by the contrivance of synodical synods, whose edicts, ratified by the Pope, are in fact papal bulls, and as such receive implicit submission from the conscience of every papist. All right, so whatever's decided in these synodical actions, ratified by the Pope, becomes binding upon the spirit of every Roman Catholic. He says there is thus established a great manufactory of Roman law on the soil of Great Britain. Okay? That's what synodical action gets. It is the government of the papacy in a foreign land given traction. That's how the Pope gains jurisdiction control over the civil laws of this land, through synodical actions. He said, should we grant that these resolutions passed in synod and afterwards ratified at Rome are mainly about spiritual matters, it is nevertheless true that they are spiritual in such a way as to imply the control of the body and the disposal of the goods of the Romanist. In truth, these synods charge themselves with the regulation of all matters pertaining to their flocks as a social and political community. A social and political community. For instance, they can place certain classes of schools under ban. Now, I have to stop and comment about this. I've read several books here on Inquisition Update, most of them years ago, talking about the early 1800s in this country when the Roman Catholics were under pressure from the Vatican and from their bishops and from their priests to pool all of their money and to build parochial schools so that popery could be taught in the elementary schools. Roman Catholics were forced to make contribution to the erection of these schools and to pay the salaries of the priests and the nuns that taught Roman Catholicism to the schools, to the children in these schools. And then they were made, a threat of excommunication if they didn't pull their children out of the public school. So the Roman Catholic Church tried to establish its own system of education in the United States of America that paid all of its allegiance to the Pope and not to the country. And to make every Roman Catholic live in this country compliant with its laws, some of them that were contrary to Roman Catholic canon law, under protest. Every little Roman Catholic child lived day to day under protest. He bound himself spiritually and temporally to the Pope, but he lived in a land that acknowledged Protestant liberties. And while they benefited from the liberty that they got from Protestants in this country to build and erect their own schools, they built those schools to educate in certain ways that would eventually overthrow the Protestant government of the country. Now, this is exactly what happened in the United States. There were many, 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 many books written about it. I've read several here on Inquisition Update. The true nature of the parochial schools. And what has led from it is a government that now reveres the Pope and canon law, and hates the Constitution, hates our liberties, and is literally making us all subjects of the Pope. This is the result of the parochial schools in this country, and the destruction of the public schools. What they did as a plan B of their parochial school system was to take the Bible out of the public schools. Why? Because the Bible is the power of Protestantism. And if you take the Bible away from Protestants, they have no power. And it worked. You ask anybody who calls himself a Christian today, how old is the earth? Well, he'll immediately tell you. Billions and billions of years. When the Bible makes it absolutely plainly, inarguably clear, the Bible tells us that through the genealogies that are written in the Bible, the earth cannot be more than 6,000 years old. You ask a Protestant today, which came first, the chicken or the egg? He can't tell you. Why? Because the Bible's been taken out of his hands. It's no longer an authoritative book. But in Genesis we read that God created the heavens and the earth and man and the animals. Did he create an egg or did he create a chicken? Well, of course he created a chicken. And then gave him the power to procreate, laying of eggs. But you ask any Christian today, almost any Christian, anywhere you go, which came first, the chicken or the egg? The first look you're going to get is one of question. That's what happens when you take the Bible out of the public schools. And then at the same time, you allow the pontiff, the Antichrist of the Bible, to create his own system of education that is against Christ. We allowed it to happen in this country. We allow it to maintain itself in this country. And we are going to suffer the consequences. Every Christian ought to know which came first, the chicken or the egg. And they will not learn until you put the Bible back in their hands. The Bible needs to be returned to the public schools. Charles Darwin needs to be evicted from the public schools. And the parochial schools need to be outlawed. And if we don't have the courage to do it, well, then we're going to suffer the consequences. And we're suffering the consequences. He says, in truth, these synods charge themselves with the regulation of all matters appertaining to their flocks as a social and political community. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church is first and foremost a political community. You cannot advance Roman Catholicism unless they have political control. And that's what all of their efforts are directed at achieving. Political control. The replacement of the civil laws with Roman Catholic canon law. And thereby they make the whole country Catholic, papal, anti-Christ. That's what's happened in America. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.